Have you ever wondered if what we call masculine strength today might actually be fear in disguise? Friedrich Nietzsche didn't see men as complete, finished, or secure beings. On the contrary, he viewed masculinity as a fragile construction, often sustained by power masks and appearances of strength. What if modern masculinity weren't a sign of virility, but rather disguised fear? What if behind the displayed self-confidence there existed only a soul that fears looking at itself? The German philosopher stripped bare, through his fierce critique, how much man hides behind inherited values, imposed rules and social roles that no longer sustain his essence. He denounced the illusion of pride, the hypocrisy of moralism, and the vanity of the alpha male who fears his own vulnerability. If Nietzsche were among us today, perhaps he'd say, the collapse of modern man was already written in his internal fragility. What we call strength is merely fear of crumbling. Have you ever asked yourself whether the image you project is truly yours, or just a reflection of social expectations? Nietzsche always looked at the human condition with suspicion. He didn't believe in fixed, solid identities, nor in eternal essences. For him, what we call the self is often a collage of roles, habits, and narratives that we repeat without realizing it. When it comes to masculinity, this vision becomes even more disturbing. Modern man, attempting to appear strong, ends up building a castle of appearances as fragile as glass. He wears symbols of power, repeats phrases of courage, performs a toughness that rarely finds echo in his intimacy. What he shows the world isn't truth, but disguise. This disguise, Nietzsche would say, is a symptom of decadence. When man needs to sustain his identity through exterior rituals, it means he's lost contact with inner strength. Think about the cultural model that still prevails. The man who doesn't cry, who doesn't ask for help, who measures his worth by the quantity of material or sexual conquests. None of this is authentic life, but theater. Masculinity becomes performance, acting before an invisible audience that judges and demands applause. Nietzsche invites us to distrust these masks. After all, what is real strength? Is it the aggressiveness that explodes to impose respect? Is it the indifference that pretends not to be affected by anything? Or could it be that, in reality, these expressions are just desperate attempts to hide intolerable fragility? Modern man, trapped in the role of alpha male, deeply fears being unmasked. He fears the possibility that someone might perceive his insecurities, his fears, his needs for affection. So he shields himself. He uses the language of toughness, wears the clothing of virility, adopts the posture of authority. But inside, his body trembles. This duplicity is suffocating. The more man tries to sustain his image, the further he distances himself from himself. Nietzsche already saw this phenomenon in his critique of inherited morality. For him, most people don't create their own values. They just repeat what was imposed by traditions, religions, and social conventions. Modern man does exactly this with his masculinity. He doesn't choose who he is, but puts on a uniform. This uniform, however, never fits perfectly. It always pinches somewhere, always lets a crack escape. It's at this point that fragility reveals itself. Look at everyday life. There's the father who believes his authority needs to be reaffirmed with shouts, never with dialogue. He thinks he's showing firmness, but what he demonstrates is fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being seen as flawed, fear of not meeting the expectation of head of household. Or the young man who, in circles of friends, laughs at feelings, despises vulnerability, speaks loudly about conquests and bravery. But in silence in the dark room, he misses affection, listening, recognition. The mask is effective before others, but weighs heavy when solitude arrives. Nietzsche would say that life under masks is unbearable, because the man who hides from himself lives in constant internal war. He needs to watch his words, his attitudes, his gestures, so that the image of virility isn't cracked by any slip. The slightest sign of fragility is seen as defeat, and thus he lives in constant alert. This permanent vigilance doesn't strengthen, it weakens. It's like carrying armor every day until the body bends under the weight. Fragile masculinity is precisely this. Not the absence of strength, but the fear of not appearing strong. It's born from the gaze of others. Man doesn't ask himself who he is, but only how he'll be seen. He lives to sustain a reputation, not to cultivate his essence. Nietzsche would consider this mode of existing as practical nihilism, an emptying of life in the name of rootless appearances. But what would be then true strength? For Nietzsche, it's not authoritarian imposition nor feigned insensitivity. Strength is the capacity to endure oneself without audience, without applause, without pre-written role. It's the courage to face vulnerability without transforming it into shame. It's being able to cry without feeling that this diminishes you, being able to love without fear of appearing weak, being able to fail without this destroying your identity. The authentic man, according to this vision, doesn't need to prove anything. His virility isn't in noise, but in serenity. He's not dependent on applause, because his root is inside, not outside. This man doesn't wear a mask because he doesn't fear being seen in his entirety. His humanity doesn't frighten him. On the contrary, it's where he finds power. Nietzsche, with his philosophical hammer, would invite each man to break the masks that suffocate him. The risk is great because without them there's always the possibility of feeling naked, exposed, vulnerable. But this is the only path to freedom. Because while man takes refuge in the theater of virility, he remains a slave to others' gaze. When he strips off the mask, he'll discover that his fragility isn't an enemy, but a source of creation, authenticity, and full life. The mask protects for a while, but one day becomes prison. And every man who desires to live grandly needs the courage to let it fall. Nietzsche saw in excessive pride one of the most subtle forms of decadence. For him, when someone needs to inflate themselves, exhibit conquests, continually assert their own superiority, this isn't a sign of strength but weakness. Pride, in this sense, functions like armor made of glass. It shines on the outside but breaks easily. It's precisely here that fragile masculinity finds its dwelling, because modern man seems incapable of existing without reaffirming his importance at every instant. Masculine pride often manifests as vanity disguised as strength. It's not just about caring for appearance or displaying results, but living in function of comparison. Man measures himself by what he possesses, by how much he dominates, by what he conquers before others' eyes. The external gaze is the mirror where he seeks validation. But the greater this dependence, the more fragile his identity becomes. Nietzsche would point to the hidden resentment in this process. Life lived in function of the other, not oneself. This type of pride reveals itself in small daily gestures. Think of the man who can't tolerate being contradicted in conversation, who feels his authority crumble when someone questions his opinion, or the one who needs to tell and retell his victories to reinforce his winner image, as if fearing that silence would erase his greatness. In both cases, it's not strength that expresses itself, but fear. Fear of losing status, fear of being seen as ordinary, fear of not being recognized. Nietzsche had already denounced this logic in his critique of moralism and decadent Christianity. He saw how resentment produced inverted values, transforming weakness into virtue. The proud man, however, falls into the same trap because he disguises his insecurity with an inflated appearance. It's as if he needed to build a golden mask to hide a trembling heart. Fragile masculinity is, therefore, a morality of vanity. Man defines himself not by what he is, but by what he manages to project. This pride, far from strengthening, imprisons. Man becomes a slave to external approval, always dependent on being seen as capable, virile, dominant. His life ceases to be a creative flow and becomes constant effort of defense. Each criticism becomes threat, each defeat an abyss, each doubt a humiliation. He can't allow himself to fail because he believes his identity will crumble along with the error. Nietzsche would call this reactive life, where the individual doesn't create, only responds. It's at this point that we perceive how fragile masculinity needs the stage to exist. The proud man doesn't know how to live in silence. He needs noise, visibility, constant affirmation. He's like an actor who never manages to leave the scene. His existence only makes sense while there's an audience. But when the lights go out, only emptiness remains. And it's precisely this emptiness that Nietzsche wanted to expose. True strength, contrary to inflated pride, is born from the capacity to endure oneself without need for exhibition. You don't need to shout your authority when it's legitimate. You don't need to assert your virility when it's lived authentically. The man who really is strong doesn't need to be reminded of this, because his presence already speaks for itself. He doesn't measure himself by what he displays, but by what he sustains in silence. Nietzsche, in denouncing pride, wasn't defending servile humility. He didn't believe in false modesty, in those who hide their achievements to appear virtuous. What he proposed was another path, genuine affirmation of one's own power without need for comparison. The creative man doesn't need to diminish anyone to feel great, because his greatness is his own work. The proud man, on the contrary, always depends on another to measure his importance. Look again at everyday life. There are men who can't stand being corrected because they confuse error with weakness. Others don't accept help because they believe this wounds their autonomy. There are also those who despise others' success, trying to devalue the other to feel superior. All of this is fragile pride, a defense mechanism against the anguish of not being enough. Nietzsche would say, this type of pride doesn't elevate, it corrodes. It's curious to perceive that masculine pride, so celebrated as a sign of virility, is precisely what denounces its fragility. The more a man needs to inflate himself, the more he exposes the emptiness he fears facing. It's like a balloon. It seems immense, but inside it's just air. Masculinity that relies on this type of pride is, therefore, an unstable building about to crumble at the slightest breath of reality. Nietzsche would call for overcoming this state. The invitation is for man not to live in function of others' gaze, but from his own source of creation. Pride can be replaced by silent strength that doesn't fear being seen in its vulnerability. This requires courage, because it implies admitting we're not unbreakable, but it's exactly this courage that differentiates the authentic man from the masked man. Pride as weakness, therefore, isn't just a psychological trait, but a way of living that imprisons. Freeing oneself from it doesn't mean denying achievements or hiding talents, but living without the obsession of proving something to everyone. True masculinity doesn't need a pedestal because it's lived as presence, not spectacle. And perhaps Nietzsche would ask us, what's the point of appearing strong to the entire world if when laying your head on the pillow you can't sustain yourself? Nietzsche saw morality as an invention of the weak to control the strong. This idea, so provocative, can be applied directly to how fragile masculinity organizes itself in the modern world. The insecure man, incapable of dealing with his own freedom and vulnerability, ends up creating or reinforcing rigid codes of conduct for himself and others. It's as if he said, a real man must be like this. But who defines this like this? And why such need to delimit boundaries? Actually, this type of morality doesn't spring from power but from fear. The insecure male fears that his identity will dissolve if clear rules about how to act don't exist. So he builds manuals, What to wear, how to speak, how to react to emotions, what to consider acceptable or shameful. Nietzsche would identify this as a symptom of herd spirit, living from external norms instead of creating one's own measure. This morality functions like armor. Man protects himself with it because he doesn't trust himself. If the code didn't exist, he wouldn't know how to act. It's like a child who needs crutches to walk. Except that in the case of the insecure male, these crutches transform into bars, and he becomes prisoner of what he believes protects him. The result is endless reproduction of gestures and discourses of a masculinity that was never chosen, only inherited. In daily life, this manifests almost automatically. The man who avoids crying because he learned that men don't cry. The one who feels desire to express affection but represses it for fear of appearing weak. The one who flees activities considered feminine just to not put his public image at risk. All of this is nothing but blind obedience to a code he doesn't even question. Nietzsche would say, this morality is slavery disguised as virility. The curious thing is that trying to show himself strong, the insecure male reveals his weakness. He constantly needs approval, can't sustain himself in his own freedom, fears judgment. Fragile masculinity is thus the morality of the weak disguised as strength. It's as if toughness were just a mask to hide the incapacity to live creatively. Nietzsche always valued the man who dares to surpass inherited rules, the free spirit who creates his own values. For him, greatness lies in living without depending on external commandments. But the insecure male does the opposite. He hides behind tradition, culture, religion, any norm that tells him who he should be. Instead of creating, he repeats. Instead of affirming life, he represses it. This mechanism of repression is, deep down, a gesture of resentment. The insecure man envies the freedom of those who live without these bonds, but incapable of assuming this freedom for himself, prefers to attack or ridicule. Therefore, many times, we see men criticizing those who express emotions, calling fragile those who dare to live outside the pattern, trying to control through mockery or contempt. It's the morality of the weak acting, leveling everything so that no one can surpass the limits they themselves don't have courage to face. Nietzsche would call this decadent life. It's not creative life, but reactive life, life of fear. The insecure male, deep down, doesn't trust himself enough to live without crutches, so he always needs a rule that tells him, here you're safe, here you continue being a man. But by leaning on these rules, he never reaches true freedom. He's a prisoner who believes he's protected, when actually he's just caged. The masculinity born from this pattern is rigid, but brittle. It seems strong on the outside, but breaks easily before the unexpected. Just one situation that escapes the script, an intense emotion, an unexpected gesture of affection, a public failure, for the entire building to collapse. The insecure male doesn't know how to improvise because he always followed a manual. And Nietzsche would remember, whoever lives only by rules never really lived. True masculine power for him isn't in blind obedience to inherited codes, but in the courage to create oneself at each instant. One must endure the anguish of freedom, the vertigo of having no manuals, the responsibility of inventing oneself without guarantees. This is the path of the strong man, not the one who binds himself to prefabricated masculinity formulas. And here arises the question that Nietzsche would launch like a hammer. Are you master of yourself, or just a repeater of expectations placed on your shoulders? The insecure male who lives by codes will never know how to answer sincerely. But the man who dares to surpass the morality of the weak will find in this gesture the beginning of his true freedom. Nietzsche saw in resentment one of the most corrosive forces of the human soul. For him, the resentful doesn't create, only reacts. doesn't possess his own energy, doesn't invent new values, doesn't affirm life. Lives looking at others, comparing himself, secretly desiring what he doesn't have courage to conquer. Fragile masculinity, in this sense, is fertile ground for resentment. The insecure man, incapable of sustaining his own power, begins to watch others to attack where he feels envy. Masculine resentment appears in various subtle forms. It manifests when a man ridicules the colleague who demonstrates feelings, as if emotion were synonymous with weakness. It arises when someone tries to diminish another's success, saying it was luck, opportunity, or privilege. It also sprouts when man feels envy of those who live authentically, without fear of breaking patterns, and instead of admiring this courage, prefers to mock or criticize. All of this is resentment, and Nietzsche would identify it as poison of the soul. The resentful is never content to look at himself. He avoids confrontation with his own fragility by projecting onto others what he can't bear to face in himself. Thus, the insecure male who fears his vulnerability attacks those who express it. What he fears isn't others' weakness, but the mirror it represents. Each time he sees another man being free, creative, or sensitive, he feels within himself the weight of not being capable of living like this. Since he can't bear this weight, he transforms it into criticism. Nietzsche saw in this mechanism the birth of slave morality. Instead of affirming his own strength, the resentful man prefers to diminish others. It's easier to judge, ridicule, condemn than to face the emptiness of one's own life. Fragile masculinity follows this same logic. It's a game of permanent comparison, where the objective is never to grow, but to prove the other is smaller. In daily life, this reveals itself in simple gestures. The friend who belittles the colleague because he takes care of his appearance, calling him too vain. The man who ironizes the one who prefers to talk instead of fight, accusing him of not being a real man. Or the father who criticizes his son for not fitting the rigid pattern of masculinity he himself inherited. In all these cases, resentment functions as defense against the anguish of difference. The other, being different, threatens my role, so it's easier to attack him than review my own beliefs. Nietzsche wouldn't spare this type of conduct. For him, the resentful is always smaller because he lives in others' shadow. Never affirms himself, only responds to what the other is or does. The insecure male becomes like this, a shadow, an echo, a frustrated spectator of others' lives. The more he compares, the more he loses contact with himself. The more he envies, the less he creates. The more he attacks, the more he reveals himself fragile. Resentment, however, doesn't need to be destiny. Nietzsche believed it's possible to transform this destructive energy into creation. But for this, courage is needed. Courage to admit envy, courage to face what's lacking, courage to recognize that one desires what one ridicules. This recognition is painful, but also liberating, because only when man looks directly at resentment can he transform it into creative impulse. Authentic masculinity doesn't fear admiring others. On the contrary, it sees in difference an opportunity for expansion. The man secure in himself doesn't need to diminish anyone because his strength doesn't depend on comparison. He can recognize greatness in others without this diminishing his own. He can learn, be inspired, transform himself. Nietzsche would call this gesture affirmation of life, instead of reacting, creating. It's precisely this that the insecure male lacks. He doesn't create because he's too busy criticizing. He doesn't live because he's too busy watching others' lives. His masculinity becomes a trench, always on the defensive, always ready to attack, never open to the new. But, as Nietzsche would say, it's in risk, in confrontation with the unknown that life becomes great. Resentment is, deep down, an invisible prison. The man who lives resentful will never be free. because he'll always be tied to others. His strength will be only reflection, never origin. The Nietzschean invitation is to break this prison, accept fragility, transform envy into creation. Only thus can masculinity cease being fragile and become true power. And perhaps Nietzsche would ask, with his provocative tone, is your strength really yours, or just a reaction to what you envy in others? Nietzsche said, one must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Now, this phrase, as poetic as it is brutal, points to a forgotten truth. Strength isn't born from perfect order, but from the capacity to cross one's own abyss. Fragile masculinity, on the contrary, is a desperate attempt to avoid chaos. The insecure man clings to masks, codes, and roles precisely because he fears looking inside and facing the turmoil that inhabits his soul. But by denying this chaos, he weakens himself. Modern man believes that being strong is being impenetrable. He imagines that virility is built through toughness, stability, absence of cracks. However, Nietzsche would reveal the fallacy of this idea. What seems too stable, sooner or later shatters. Life is movement, transformation, conflict. The man who can't bear internal chaos is condemned to be dominated by it unconsciously. But the one who dares face it can transform it into a source of creation. The chaos Nietzsche speaks of isn't superficial mess, but the set of forces, desires, fears, and contradictions that inhabit each human being. Fragile masculinity tries to suffocate this chaos because it fears it will destroy the constructed image of strength. Thus, the man who feels like crying represses tears. The one who desires to express affection closes himself in silence. The one who has fear disguises it with anger. But by hiding all this, he eliminates nothing. He just transfers to the unconscious, where these forces accumulate like gunpowder ready to explode. That's why so many times we see men who seem strong crumble before small crises. It's not that they're weak in essence, but because they never learned to deal with the chaos they carried inside. They lived by denial, and denial always has an expiration date. Nietzsche would say, one must look inside, even if what one sees frightens. Chaos isn't enemy, but raw material of greatness. Imagine the man who recognizes his anger instead of denying it. He can transform it into energy to create, fight for something meaningful, build new paths. Or the one who accepts his vulnerability. Instead of hiding it, he uses it to cultivate empathy, connection, and depth in relationships. Chaos, when faced, ceases being prison and becomes power. It's exactly this that Nietzsche called transmutation of values, transforming what seemed negative into source of life. The insecure male, on the contrary, prefers to keep chaos hidden. He lives in constant effort to appear whole, solid, immutable. But this posture is only mask, and mask always weighs. The man who never admits fear ends up living with constant fear of being unmasked. The one who never admits pain becomes slave to the pain he hides. The one who never admits doubts is corroded in silence by his own uncertainty. This masculinity doesn't bear chaos, and therefore will never give birth to the dancing star. Nietzsche would provoke us to invert logic. Instead of fleeing chaos, embrace it. Instead of denying fragility, integrate it. The true man for him isn't the one who never falls, but the one who knows how to transform his fall into step. It's in chaos that creativity is born. It's in contradiction that depth emerges. It's in fear that courage is discovered. Authentic masculinity doesn't fear shadow because it knows that light also springs from it. Look again at everyday life. There are men who, facing great losses, discover within themselves unexpected strength. Others, by assuming their emotions, perceive they didn't lose respect, but gained more truthful bonds. These examples show that chaos doesn't destroy. When accepted, it transforms. Fragile masculinity, on the contrary, remains immobile. because it spends all energy trying to sustain the illusion of stability. Nietzsche believed that only those who cross chaos can create new values. The man who faces his own darkness is apt to reinvent himself. The one who avoids it remains repeating the same role, chained to a pattern he never chose. Chaos is the furnace of freedom, but the insecure male prefers the comfort of prison because he fears the flames. Greatness, however, is only born in fire. Internal chaos, when welcomed, doesn't destroy man, it recreates him. Fragile masculinity, which so fears the abyss, needs to learn that it's in the abyss that true power reveals itself. And Nietzsche, with his habitual provocation, would leave us the question: do you prefer living trapped to a stable mask or risking yourself in chaos to discover who you really are? Nietzsche never wanted to destroy man. What he wanted to destroy were the illusions that prevented man from flourishing. His fierce critique of morality, inherited traditions, and social masks didn't aim to reduce humanity to dust, but to open space for something greater, the emergence of a human being who creates himself. In the case of masculinity, this means surpassing the figure of the insecure male, of fragile and defensive masculinity, and inaugurating a new form of being virile, not based on masks, inflated pride, or resentment, but on authenticity and creation. The new virile isn't the one who shouts loudest, but the one who can remain in silence with himself without fear of what he finds. It's not the one who needs to dominate others to feel strong, but the one who dominates himself. Nietzsche would call this man a creator of values, someone who doesn't limit himself to repeating what he was taught about being a man, but who invents his own way of existing. This virility isn't absence of fragility, but integration of it as part of human wholeness, transforming vulnerability into creative force rather than shameful weakness to hide, discovering in authenticity the path to genuine greatness that doesn't depend on others' approval but springs from inner truth lived with courage and without masks. Which city are you watching from? Drop a comment below.